Hi, I'm Mikey, welcome to my sewing room and thanks for joining me. Today I'd like to talk to you, if I may, about the Harry boxer briefs and trunks pattern from Sirena Patterns. I have put all of their links down in the description below, so please go and check them out if you can. Sirena Patterns are an independent pattern company with loads of patterns available on their website, and they're all available in Spanish and English. Their main focus is swimwear and activewear, and this is one of the few menswear patterns that's available over on their site. I've made around 4 or 5 pairs of these now, and if you stick around I'll show you step by step how I made mine, and I'll also show you a couple of the pairs that I've made. The pattern is great for beginners. It's ideal for someone who wants to have a first try at making underwear, or for someone who wants to experiment with stretch fabrics. Ideally you would have an overlocker and a cover stitch machine to make these. However, if you have neither of those, they are completely doable on a domestic sewing machine using functional stretch stitches, zigzag stitches and twin needles, for example, for the hems. I did use my overlocker for these, but I didn't feel like getting the cover stitch machine out and I didn't have a twin needle handy. So you'll see that when it came to doing the hems, I used an alternate method using my regular sewing machine using one of the built-in stitches. The pattern has both Spanish and English written instructions. They're very clear and easy to follow, and they are complemented by high quality photographs as well. The stitching lines are all marked out, and because they are photographs and not diagrams, it makes it really easy to see which is the right side and the wrong side of the fabric. When you download the pattern, you'll see that there are 3 separate files, so you'll get a print at home version, a copy shop version and the instructions as a separate file. Both the print at home version and the copy shop version come with layers, so before you print you are able to select just the size that you want and print only that size. It's a great feature, and I do wish that all PDF pattern companies offered that. The pages on the print at home version are really clearly marked, so you can see exactly which pages are going to join where. That makes it super easy to trim them down and really easy to join them together as well. If you haven't used a PDF pattern before, or you're not used to joining PDF patterns together, that is something that I'll cover in the step-by-step as well. Overall, I was really impressed with the pattern. It's very easy to make, I've made lots of them and I'll definitely be making more. And because it is so simple to make, it means, first of all, you don't need to set aside lots of time to make them, but secondly, there are lots of options for modification if you're comfortable with modifying patterns. I'd like to say a big thank you to Tommie over at Sirena Patterns for sending me the pattern to review. Please stick around if you'd like to see the step-by-step of how I made my pattern, and please feel free to share with me on Instagram your finished makes. The video is time-stamped, so please feel free to skip ahead to whichever part you're interested in, and if you're ready, let's get to the sewing table. I have my pattern cut out, and as with any PDF pattern, the first thing I want to do is to check that it's printed at the correct size. Here I am with my quilting ruler, and you can see that I've placed a 2-inch square over the 2-inch square on the first page. I'm happy that it's printed correctly, so the next thing I'm going to do is trim the edges and stick the pattern together. I'll trim off the right hand side and the bottom edge on each page where it's indicated by these blue triangles, and the blue triangles will line up to tell me which page goes where. You can see I've already done that on the first page here, so on the second page I'm lining up my quilting ruler with a black line down the side, and I'm going to take a sharp craft knife, excuse my head, and trim off the side of the page. Flip it 90 degrees, onto the bottom edge, exactly the same thing. You can see I'm really carefully lining up my quilting ruler, a bit of pressure on the ruler to stop it from moving around, and a nice even trim with my sharp blade. At this point I'm going to check that everything lines up, and there's a few places on the pattern that I like to check. So the first thing I'm going to do is check the lines of the pattern itself and make sure that these flow correctly from one page to another. You can see that just here. And secondly, I'll check these blue triangles to make sure that I've got the correct ones aligned. Let's trim the rest of the pages, and then it's time to line up the pattern and stick the pages together. Personally, I prefer to use a glue stick to join my pages together. However, I have seen lots of people use tape to do this as well. I just find that with a glue stick, it means that I can be more accurate when I'm sticking the pages, as if they're a little bit off, I can still slide them around a little bit until I'm happy with them. You can see here I'm just manipulating those 2 pages just to make sure everything flows correctly from one page to another. And then another check just to make sure that the triangles match up. Let's join up the rest of the pages and then we'll join each row together as well. When I join the rows together, I like to do exactly the same thing, so I'll line them up first just to make sure everything looks right, put the glue all the way across, and then I'm going to line up each page and each set of triangles. You'll see that this pattern, as with lots of patterns, there are some pages that don't form part of a row and they just need to be joined as they are. I'm not going to treat this page any differently. I'm going to apply the glue and then I'm going to make sure that the lines flow from one page to another and match up those triangles. This pattern does actually come as a layered PDF, so you can select just the size that you want to make and print only that size. I didn't do that, so here I am having a look in the pattern at the size guide to see which size I need to cut out. I like to roughly cut out the pieces first with my scissors, just to make sure that when I'm actually cutting out the pieces, I don't accidentally cut into any of the other pieces on the surrounding paper. Another look at the pattern just to make sure I'm cutting out the right pieces. I want to make view B, however, my furry little assistant here has other ideas. Let's try that again. So I'm going to make view B, which means that I'm going to cut out all of the pieces at the lines that say cut here for view B. Now, just as before, I like to use my craft knife to cut out the pattern pieces, and anywhere where there's a straight edge, I'll also use a quilting ruler to make sure that that edge is nice and straight. Of course, plenty of people use scissors or a rotary cutter. I just find that, for me, this is the way that I get the most precise cuts. When I'm cutting out curves, you can see that I'm holding down the paper, not applying too much pressure with the craft knife, and I'm going really slowly. So I've left this in real time so that you can see the speed that I actually cut out the pattern pieces. I'm going to turn it around again and bring out that ruler once more to cut out this nice straight edge. And then onto this last little curve here, and again you can see I go really slowly when I'm cutting out these pieces just to make sure it's nice and precise. Now, onto the bottom edge, and here are those lines that I was talking about before. So one says cut here for view A, and one says cut here for view B. As I mentioned, I'm making view B, so that's the line that I'm going to cut across. And then of course, I'm sure we've all done it. I didn't apply quite enough pressure here where the pages are stuck together, so I just needed to go and give that another little trim. I'm going to cut out the rest of the pattern pieces, just cutting them out in exactly the same way, making sure I select the correct size and the correct view. I've left this part in real time, so hopefully you can spot the mistake that I didn't. This is the gusset piece, and this is 4 straight edges, so I used my ruler to cut each edge out. However, as I mentioned before, I'm making view B. So there are 2 different sizes of gusset, of course, because there are 2 different leg lengths. I didn't notice that actually here I was cutting out view A. It's fine because I can trim it down later on. However, if you make the mistake the other way, you might need to reprint this piece. All of my pattern pieces are now cut out with the exception of the waistband piece. I find it easier to leave that intact so that I can just lay the waistband elastic on top rather than trying to mess around with a small piece of paper. Next up, I'm going to have a look at the cutting layout in the pattern. Any good pattern should have one of these, and it's just the best way to lay out your pattern pieces on your fabric to minimize fabric waste. And you can see that it shows view A and view B. Of course, I'm making view B, so that's the layout that I'm going to go for. Here I'm laying out my fabric, and what I'm going to do is check that I've got the greatest stretch running left to right and that I've got a nice straight fold running up that left side of the pattern. It's now ready for the pattern pieces, so I'm just going to place those on and I'm going to make sure that that straight edge really lines up with that fold. You can see I'm going to move it around a couple of times. I'm going to check that the top of the fabric is even, and then once I'm happy, I'm going to start to cut out the pieces with my rotary cutter. I do use two different sizes of rotary cutters when I'm cutting out my fabrics. One is a 45mm, one is a 25mm blade. I prefer the 25mm blade for curves, and I prefer the 45mm for any thicker fabrics and any straight edges. Although sometimes, as you can see here, I just find it easier to use the 25mm for the whole thing. It is important to take your time when you're cutting fabric, especially stretchy fabric like this, because it will shift, it will move around underneath the blade. So I'm not putting very much pressure on, I'm cutting directly around my paper pattern pieces, and you can see that I keep stopping just to check that the fabric hasn't moved underneath. Then I'm going to pull the fabric away and make sure it was a nice clean cut, take off my weights, and then check that fabric just to make sure that it's cut out nice and evenly all the way around. I'm happy with that one, so the next piece I'm going to line up and do exactly the same. You can see I'm going nice and slowly, although this footage is sped up, around all of those edges, checking as I go to make sure that the fabric isn't shifting underneath. These weights that I'm using are actually just old kitchen weights. You can use anything to weigh your fabric down as long as it's nice and sturdy and it holds everything in place. Especially with stretchy fabrics, it's so important to make sure that nothing moves while you're cutting, otherwise you'll end up with jagged edges and uneven pieces. This is the last piece that's cut with the fabric doubled. You can see I have flipped it over, however that's not strictly necessary since I'm using the fabric folded in half right sides together. This is used for the outer and the lining of the front pouch. The last piece that I'm going to cut out is the gusset piece, and as I mentioned previously, I did cut the wrong size out of the paper, so I have trimmed that down. This is cut out of a single piece of fabric, so you don't need this doubled, so it does need to be with the right side of the fabric facing up. As I mentioned earlier, I don't cut out the paper piece for the waistband elastic. I like to lay it flat on the table, find the size that I'm going to be cutting, and then lay my elastic on top. When I'm happy that the piece is laid flat with no stretch, I'm just going to trim the end with some pinking shears just to stop any fraying. Now, quick check to make sure we've got everything. Waistband elastic, piece 1, 2 of those, that's the front. Piece 2, that's the back, 1 of those. Piece 3, front pouch, 4 of those. And piece 4, the gusset, 1 of those. As with any pattern, it's really important to mark out all of your notches on your fabric pieces. I'm just going to use some tiny little triangular snips into the edges of the fabric, but not too deep, because with any knit fabric, those little notches can cause it to start to unravel. Next, we're going to sew those pieces together, making sure that we do match up those notches. So, I like to use clips, you can use pins or whatever you like here. Just make sure that you use plenty of them, because as I mentioned before, this is slippery fabric. So, over to the overlocker. The first thing I'm going to do is make sure that those needles are as far up as they can go and that my presser foot is up as well. I'm going to slide the fabric all the way under and then put the presser foot down, making sure that I've taken into account my 1/4 inch seam allowance. My blade is engaged, so it is going to trim off the edge of the fabric as I go. I'm just going to go very slowly here. This is a curve, so I want to make sure that everything matches up perfectly. If you're unsure of your overlocker settings, do some testing first. This is what it should look like, nice even stitches all the way down. The upper looper isn't visible underneath and the lower looper isn't visible on the top. When you open it out, you shouldn't be able to see any of those stitches on the right side of the fabric. I've done that for both the lining and the outer pieces, and now it's time to baste them together. So they need to be wrong sides facing, that means the right side is on the outside. I'm going to line them up, make sure I use lots of clips, and then I'm going to take them over to the regular sewing machine and just use a basting stitch to hold them in place until I attach the front pieces. Once all of those clips are in place, I'm going to sew down both edges using the regular sewing machine as I mentioned. It's really important that you use a ballpoint needle on your sewing machine which is designed for stretch fabrics. When you're basting this at your sewing machine, you can use a regular basting stitch which is just a very long stitch. However, I use a brother machine which has this lightning bolt stitch, so I like to use that whenever I sew stretch fabrics. Remember, this basting won't be seen in your finished garment and it needs to be within your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Here's what those pieces look like after they've been basted. So I've basted down both sides and you can see that because I've used the lightning bolt stitch, there is still a nice stretch to the fabric. It doesn't affect it. If you have used a straight stitch, you may need to remove those after you've done the next step. Speaking of which, here I am with the front pieces. I'm just cutting in my notches so that I can match up the notch to the sides of the front pouch. And I'm going to join those together, clip them and stitch them in the same way. So just like before, it's really important to match up that notch. So that's the first thing that I've joined, and then I'm going to make sure the top and the bottom align perfectly. Pop some clips on there and then enough clips in between to hold it in place while I take it over to the overlocker. That's my clips all in place, so I'll take this over to the overlocker and stitch all the way down one side. Okay, back from the overlocker, and what you should see is that the top and bottom edges on both pieces line up nicely. I'll just quickly trim those overlocker threads off, and then the next thing that I'm going to do is match up the other side, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Match up the notches, plenty of clips, and take it over to the overlocker. Once again, the first thing I do is lift those needles all the way up, lift my presser foot, and push the fabric all the way up to the needles. I'm being mindful of my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm just going very slowly along this curve. Here's what we've got so far, and the next step is to join the back. When you open out the back piece, we're going to match up the side seams here, and they should align perfectly at the top and bottom, so we're going to put plenty of clips and stitch from top to bottom on both sides. After stitching those edges, this is what it looks like so far. I'm going to turn it inside out and we're going to move on to the next step, which is adding the gusset. So far we've joined up pieces 1, 2 and 3, and now we're going to add piece 4, which is the gusset piece. For me, I find this easier to work wrong side out, and I'll join the gusset piece making sure that the 3 notches match up to the seams on the front pouch. I'm going to open my fabric out and I'm going to join the gusset piece right sides together using plenty of clips, making sure that all those notches match up, as well as the edges of the gusset piece and the front pouch. And then I'll do exactly the same with the back. There's only one notch on the back of the gusset and that needs to match up with the center of the back piece. And here's what you should have so far. Now it's time to add on the elastic, and you can see that I have already joined the edges of my elastic. I overlapped the edges by about 1/2 inch and I used a regular zigzag stitch on my sewing machine. My stitch settings for this were just under a 1mm stitch length, so around about a 0.8mm stitch length and a 3mm stitch width. Out comes the pin cushion, and what I need to do here is divide the elastic evenly into 4. So I'm going to take it and fold it in half and pop a pin opposite the join at the back so that I know where the center front is. Then I'll line up the center front and the center back so that I know where my side seams are, and I'll add a pin to each of those. Each of those pins is then going to match up with a seam or a notch on the main fabric. If you haven't done this already, you can add a notch to the center back by folding the piece in half, matching up the side seams, and just adding a tiny little notch in the top there. And then I'll start pinning right sides together with the fabric. And here's my furry little assistant again, just to make sure I'm using enough pins. So I've added the rest of the pins, and you can see that I've added them probably around about every 1 to 1.5 inches all the way around. That just makes sure that nothing's going to move and that everything's going to stay even as I'm sewing it. Now for this step, I do like to disengage the blade on my overlocker to make sure I'm not trimming off anything from the elastic. So I need to really make sure that the edge of the fabric and the elastic are together and they line up with the line on my overlocker that tells me where the edges of my stitches are going to be. Any excess bits of thread like this can be snipped off as you're working around. Once the elastic's all in place, it's time to hem the legs. So what I like to do here is to mark out my 1/2 inch seam allowance with a long basting stitch. I'm just going to use a very long regular straight stitch because this will be removed once I've added the hems. I like to do this with fabrics that I can't press so that I've got a nice even straight line which shows me where to fold before I sew. Now that the basting's in place, I have a nice even line showing me where to fold. And because this is a knit fabric, it only requires a single fold. I'll fold that under and apply lots of clips. As you can see, I like to use lots of clips to make sure that nothing moves while I'm stitching it in place. I'm going to stitch around both legs in a single long stitch. The pattern recommends either using a twin needle or a cover stitch machine if you have one. I'm actually going to use the lightning bolt stitch that I showed earlier because it's a great stretchy stitch and it only requires 1 spool of thread. I like to really take my time with this top stitching as this will be visible on the outside of the finished garment. Coming up to any seams, I go even slower and I make sure that I manipulate the fabric in such a way that nothing moves underneath and it passes under the presser foot evenly. It's also important not to pull the fabric as this can stretch and make the stitches uneven on the surface. This can also affect the strength of the stitches. And here's how my finished trunks look. There are loads of ways that you can modify this pattern if you're comfortable with it. For example, I chose to add a row of top stitching just underneath the elastic at the top. And of course, there are an infinite number of patterns available for all the different fabrics out there. Have fun with it, try lots of styles and lots of colours. Here's another pair that I made, being modelled by my husband. And that's the complete step-by-step. Once again, I'd like to say thank you to Tommie over at Sirena Patterns for sending me the pattern over to review. If you want to see what else I've been making, please feel free to check out my Instagram. Let me know what you thought in the comments down below. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.